A Ukrainian mathematics professor walked into a Russian-controlled supply office carrying nothing but a fake identity card and a notebook. And over the next 5 months, she quietly collected something that no satellite, no drone, and no Special Forces unit had ever been able to obtain. Her name was Darina Kovalenko, and she was not a spy, she was not a soldier, and she had never held a weapon in her life. But what she wrote in that notebook every single day would eventually reach the desks of military planners who could not believe that the most valuable intelligence of the entire operation had been hidden inside routine paperwork all along. Before the war, Darina Kovalenko spent her mornings writing equations on a university chalkboard in Kharkiv. She taught applied mathematics to undergraduate students who were more interested in their phones than in probability theory. She was known among her colleagues as someone with an unusual gift, not for solving problems but for noticing patterns that other people could not see. She once identified a grading error in a standardized national exam, not because she had access to the answer key, but because the statistical distribution of correct answers across 4,000 student submissions was slightly too perfect to have occurred naturally. The examination board initially dismissed her findings. It took them 6 weeks to confirm she had been right all along. When the war began, Darina did not leave. She watched her university close its doors. She watched her students scatter. She watched her city change in ways that are difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced a familiar place becoming something entirely unrecognizable. She had no military background, no intelligence training, and no connections to any government agency, but she had something that would eventually prove more valuable than any of those things. She had a mind that could not stop counting. The regional supply office, where Darina eventually found a position as a low-level administrative clerk, was not a glamorous or strategically obvious target. It processed paperwork, it tracked inventory, it managed the kind of logistical documentation that most people in military planning consider background noise. The office handled requests for food supplies, fuel allocations, vehicle maintenance records, and personnel scheduling across a wide area of the region. Nobody at the office considered the paperwork they processed to be sensitive. Nobody considered a middle-aged mathematics teacher sorting filing cabinets to be a threat. Nobody considered that the numbers flowing through that office every single day were telling a story. Darina began her first week doing exactly what she was supposed to do. She filed, she sorted, she organized. She said very little and observed a great deal. She noticed that certain supply requests arrived on specific days of the week. She noticed that the quantities listed in fuel allocation forms followed patterns that did not match the vehicle counts listed in the same documents. She noticed that food requisition forms for certain units were consistently submitted 3 days before any corresponding personnel movement. Orders were filed which suggested that someone somewhere was planning movements before those movements had been officially authorized. She wrote none of this down at the office. She committed it to memory and transferred it each evening into a notebook she kept at home, inside a hollowed-out section of a mathematics textbook she carried in her bag. Every day by the end of her 3rd week, Darina had identified something that would take her several more weeks to fully understand. The supply patterns flowing through that office were not random, and they were not simply bureaucratic. They were rhythmic in a way that suggested a coordination layer that did not appear anywhere in the official documentation. She was processing every 11 days. A specific sequence of supply requests would arrive in a particular order. The sequence was never identical, but the underlying structure was consistent enough that Darina began to map it on graph paper she kept inside the same textbook. Each point on the graph represented a supply category. Each line represented the interval between requests. She was not yet sure what the pattern meant, but she was certain that it meant something. The 5 months that followed were described by those who later reviewed her work as one of the most methodical examples of non-technical intelligence collection documented during the conflict. Darina never accessed any classified system. She never photographed any document. She never made any copies of any file. Everything she gathered existed only in her notebook, written in a personal shorthand notation system that she had developed herself over years of academic work, and that bore no resemblance to any standard notation anyone outside her field would recognize. She tracked fuel allocation volumes and cross-referenced them against vehicle maintenance schedules. She tracked food supply quantities and cross-referenced them against personnel records. She tracked the timing of requests and mapped the intervals against geographical data she reconstructed from memory based on place names mentioned casually in office conversations. What she eventually produced was not a report in any conventional intelligence format. It was a mathematical model, a series of equations and probability distributions that described with considerable precision the likely movement patterns of large, logistical units across the region. The model did not require access to any military communication. It did not require satellite imagery. It did not require any source inside the military command structure. It required only the numbers that had been flowing through a regional supply office every single day, and a mind that knew how to listen to what numbers say when most people are not paying attention. The notebook reached a Ukrainian military intelligence contact through a channel that has not been publicly detailed. The analysts who first received it spent several days attempting to understand what they were looking at. The notation system was unfamiliar. The structure of the model was unconventional. One analyst who reviewed the material later described the experience of reading Darina's notebook as similar to receiving a message written in a language you have never studied, but somehow instinctively recognize as meaningful. It took the team approximately 4 days to fully translate her notation into formats compatible with their existing analytical systems. When they did, the implications became difficult. To set aside the patterns Darina had documented suggested a rhythm of logistical activity that pointed toward a specific type of operational preparation. The model she had constructed indicated a high probability that a significant reallocation of resources was underway in a pattern consistent with preparation for a sustained operation in a particular direction. The military planners who reviewed the final assessment noted that the level of specificity in Darina's analysis was comparable to what would typically require weeks of aerial surveillance, signals intelligence collection, and multiple human sources operating simultaneously inside the target area. She had produced it alone over 5 months with a notebook, a pencil, and a mind trained to find patterns in places where most people see only noise. What makes Darina Kovalenko's story worth examining is not the outcome, it is the method. She did not intercept a communication. She did not access a secure system. She did not rely on any technology more advanced than graph paper and arithmetic. She relied on a principle that intelligence analysts have understood for generations, but that modern warfare has increasingly moved away from in favor of technical collection. The principle that large organizations, no matter how disciplined, cannot entirely conceal the patterns created by their own routine behavior. Every supply request filed, every fuel allocation processed, every food requisition submitted was a data point, and data points, when observed with enough patience and enough mathematical rigor, begin to tell a story that no amount of operational security can fully suppress. The most carefully guarded secrets in any organization are rarely the ones protected by encryption or armed guards. They are the ones hiding in plain sight inside the ordinary numbers that keep the organization functioning day after day. If this story made you think differently about what intelligence actually looks like in modern conflict, then you are in the right place. Every week we examine operations and decisions from this war that most coverage never gets close to. Not the headlines, not the press releases, the mechanics, the reasoning, the details that explain how and why things unfolded the way they did. If that kind of analysis is what you are looking for, subscribe and make sure notifications are turned on, because every single story we bring you is built the same way Darina built her model, one careful observation at a time, and not a single detail is there by accident.